Benjamin Graham once said that the investor's chief problem, even his worst enemy, is likely to be himself. I'm going to spend most of the next hour talking about things that individual investors do that make them their own worst enemies when it comes to investing. But first, I wanted to talk to you about why I think finance is harder than accounting. Are there any accountants here? Not a single accountant. All right. Well, the reason I think that finance is harder than accounting is that to be an accountant, to understand accounting, you have to be able to add and subtract. You have to be able to deal with quantities. And human beings have a good intuitive grasp of quantities. However, to really understand finance, you have to understand probability. And human beings actually don't have such a good intuitive grasp of probability. And so we end up using a lot of heuristics or rules of thumbs or sort of mental shortcuts to deal with probabilities. Okay, I'll show you what I mean. I hope. Okay, let's see if we can get this to work. There we go. All right, 2 plus 2. Everybody knows what 2 plus 2 is, right? Little children know what 2 plus 2 is. There are occasional exceptions. For example, these days, if you ask an accountant what's 2 plus 2, he's likely to reply, what do you need it to be? But most of us would agree 2 plus 2 is 4. Okay? Simple addition problem. Now, how about a simple probability problem? If I flip 2 coins, what's the probability that both coins come up heads? How many of you are pretty sure you know the answer to that? All right. Good. So the probability is 25%. Okay? Now, I'm going to make both problems a little bit harder. 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2. Did anyone get it? Yeah. You just look at it. I don't even see anyone. You just look. 8 apples. Okay? It's easy. What if I make the probability problem a little harder? Instead of flipping 2 coins, I'm going to flip 4 coins. That, by the way, is the technical high point of this talk. It took me 3 hours to figure out how to flip the coins on the screen. Okay. If I flip 4 coins, what's the probability that any 3 come up heads? I don't care about the order, and the other one comes up tails. How many of you are sure you know the answer to that? No? You have... What do you think the probability is?
0.20 times 5 to the power. Half and 4 to the power. I'm sorry. 1 half, 4 to the power.
To the 4th power? Oh, that would be 1 out of 16. Which, in this case, actually, it's also 1 out of 4. It's 1 out of 16 if the order matters. But if you don't care about the order, it's only 1 out of 4. But my point, we're not going to have a lecture on statistics today, or probability, and I'm not going to talk about permutations. My point is, it doesn't come to us easily. Okay? If you haven't studied this, and probably studied it recently, you don't know what the probability is. And people don't approximate. It's not that they guess and tend to guess correctly. I ran an informal study, and I found that people, their guesses were all over the place. They didn't converge on the right answer. So we tend to have a good intuitive grasp of quantities, but not of probabilities. And as I mentioned before, we use a lot of sort of mental shortcuts to assess probabilities. I'll give an example. Try to think of a company that went public in the United States, say, within the last 10 years, but not the last 5 years. Now, I realize that this question is easier when you live in the States, but perhaps some of you thought of this company. That's what most of my students end up saying. Oh, what about Google? Now try to think of a company that went public. So first to think of a company that went public that was successful, and people think of Google. And if I ask them to think of a company that was unsuccessful, mostly people have a difficult time thinking of the ones that were unsuccessful. So most investors, most of my students, when I poll them, they can easily remember very successful companies, but they don't remember the ones that have failed, the ones that have gone bankrupt. And for that reason, they tend to overestimate the likelihood that companies will be successful. So suppose that an individual investor is thinking of buying a high-tech company during its IPO. And he says to himself, I wonder how often these companies are very successful. And he thinks of Google, and he says, well, that was really successful. And then he thinks about some of the other big companies, Apple and Microsoft, and say, well, those were really successful. And when he then asks himself, well, how often are companies not successful, it's harder to think of examples of companies that went public and then failed. We tend to remember the big, exciting failures like Enron and 3Com, but not companies that just sort of faded away. So this investor, it's quite likely, if he just estimates probabilities by how easily examples come to mind, he will overestimate the likelihood that this company is going to be successful. So it will increase the probability that he buys in the IPO. And most recently, that might result in him calling up his broker and saying, please get me some Facebook stock, because I'm sure Facebook is going to be successful because all these other companies were. Okay, some of you, those of you who studied finance academically, undoubtedly heard of the efficient market hypothesis. Gene Fama, who teaches at the University of Chicago, is one of the big proponents. And Gene described it once. He said that a market in which prices always fully reflect available information is efficient. And this, when I started studying finance back around in 1990, this was the dominant paradigm in academic finance. This is what we were taught in the classroom. If you went to a class, you were taught markets are efficient. But not everyone believes that markets are efficient. For example, Warren Buffett, the famous U.S. investor, once said, I'd be a bum in the street with a tin cup if markets were efficient. So there's some disagreement. So when I think about market efficiency versus, the world of inefficient markets, I often use an analogy to games that people might play when they go to Las Vegas, when they go to a casino. And to me, efficient markets are like the game of roulette. And that's because everyone has the same chance of winning. It's basically a level playing field. If I play roulette, if I put my money on one number, and one of you puts your money on another number, we both have the same chance of winning. So that's one view of markets. Another view, the one to which I personally subscribe, is that markets are more like the game of poker. Okay, now imagine that you were at a casino in Las Vegas, and you went to a room in the back, and there are 10 guys, and it's probably guys, 10 men, playing poker. They're playing Texas Hold'em, which is a very popular poker game. Okay, now they're in the middle of a hand, and you talk to the hostess for a moment. She's waiting to serve drinks, and she says, yeah, there are 10 guys here. 7 of them are tourists. They came from Des Moines, Iowa, a farming area in the United States. And they're in Las Vegas for 1 week, and they're playing poker every night. The other 3 people, the other 3 men, are professional poker players who live in Las Vegas and play poker for a living. Who do you think is going to win? Any one hand, it's probably a tourist who will win, because there are 7 tourists and only 3 professionals. But the tourists will tend to win from each other, not from the professionals. And when the tourists win, they'll win less. And when they lose, they'll tend to lose more. And over the course of the night, and certainly over the course of the week, the money will flow from the tourists to the professional poker players. And to some extent, I think this does happen. This happens in markets. And largely, the tourists in markets are individuals, and the professionals are professionals, professional investors, whether it's people like Goldman Sachs or at Citibank or at a hedge fund or a mutual fund. They tend to have more information and more skill when it comes to investing.